The words were spoken in late July light, on a lawn that still held the warmth of the afternoon. Charlotte stood slightly apart from the older girls, the small diamond and sapphire brooch pinned high on her dress catching the sun each time she breathed. One of them gestured toward it. Another leaned in and said, with the casual cruelty of children who have absorbed adult resentments without understanding their weight, that Charlotte was only the granddaughter of the woman who had broken the marriage. Diana's name was used, then used again, attached to adjectives that should never have been spoken to a 9-year-old who carried that blood. Then came the demand, framed as a joke that was not a joke, that she should take the brooch off and let them try it, that she should share, that it was only fair. Charlotte did not cry. She did not answer. She simply went still. The particular stillness royal children learn early, a stillness that is both shield and signal. Across the garden, Catherine saw it and felt the familiar calculation of cost against necessity. William saw it a moment later. Neither moved at once. What neither fully registered in that instant was that Carole Middleton had been watching the entire exchange, and that something inside her had settled with the finality of a decision long delayed. That decision would take nearly 3 months to reach its full effect. It would leave no smashed glass, no raised voices caught on camera, no public confrontation for the commentary channels to dissect. It would, however, permanently alter the quiet distribution of privilege inside the household, and it would teach the Queen Consort that certain lines, once crossed in the presence of the right witness, could not be restored by charm or by time. Camilla had never issued a formal instruction. There was no memorandum declaring that her granddaughters from the Parker Bowles and Lopes sides of the family were to be treated as informal members of the working circle. The elevation happened the way most durable changes happen around the monarchy, through accumulation, through the absence of objection, through the soft power of repeated precedent. After the coronation, the invitations multiplied. At Trooping the Color, the same young women appeared in positions that had previously belonged only to those carrying out official duties or standing in the direct line. At Royal Ascot, they arrived in cars that were not their own, dressed in clothes whose cut and fabric spoke of institutional approval, escorted by staff who answered to someone higher than their parents. At anniversary services and certain receptions for visiting heads of state, they materialized near the senior royals with a consistency that household staff first noticed and then carefully stopped commenting upon. The language used to justify it was mild: educational exposure, familiarity with public life, family continuity. The money that traveled with those phrases came from a mixture of private royal funds and the more flexible edges of public channels. No one in the private secretary's offices raised a formal protest. The king preferred calm. Camilla was queen. And the girls themselves, poised, photogenic, increasingly assured, understood the silent contract. They smiled for the right cameras and absorbed the atmosphere of access until access began to feel like entitlement. For many months, the pattern produced only low-grade resentment. Catherine noticed and said nothing. William noticed and told himself he would address it later. Staff exchanged glances in corridors and kept walking. The arrangement might have hardened into custom if the granddaughters had limited themselves to appearing and performing the expected graciousness. They did not. The private summer gathering took place at a country house belonging to a senior member of the extended family. No press, no cameras, only blood relations, trusted staff, and the careful conversation that fills rooms where everyone understands the unwritten rules. Charlotte was 9. She had been allowed the small brooch, an heirloom that had once belonged to her great-grandmother and had been given to her by her mother with the quiet instruction that it was not a plaything. She wore it high on the bodice of a pale dress. The conversation among the older girls began lightly and then did not remain light. Remarks about people who arrived from nowhere, references to the woman who broke the marriage, Diana's name spoken with the casual ownership of children who had heard the story only from one side, and then the demand for the brooch, delivered with the confidence of those who had grown used to receiving what they asked for. Charlotte's stillness was absolute. Catherine felt it from across the lawn like a change in air pressure. William felt it a moment later. Neither intervened immediately. Both understood the cost of a public correction in a private setting. Carole Middleton, standing 20 feet away with an untouched glass of elderflower cordial, understood something else, that the pattern had finally become visible in a form that could not be ignored. She left the party early. She offered the ordinary, polite excuses. She drove herself back to Bucklebury through the long summer evening and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook she had not opened in years. She did not telephone her daughter. She did not draft an angry message. She began with dates. The 6 weeks that followed were quiet in the particular way that only people who have lived inside systems of power recognize as dangerous. Carole made no calls to journalists. She posted nothing. She sought no conversation with Camilla or with the parents of the girls involved. Instead, she reconstructed a timeline with methodical patience. Every public appearance the non-royal granddaughters had made since the coronation. Every adjustment to seating or processional order. Every instance in which wardrobe, transport, or overnight accommodation had been provided through channels that normally served only working members of the family or those in the direct line. She drew on contacts she had maintained from the years when the Middletons were still regarded as outsiders, event organizers who remembered which requests had come from which offices, former household staff who still answered a discreet inquiry, people who worked the softer logistical edges of royal life and noticed anomalies long before they were formalized. The dossier that resulted was deliberately thin. No stolen emails, no recordings, only a precise dated catalog of privileges extended to young women who held no formal role, accompanied by reasoned estimates of cost drawn from publicly available and semi-public sources. Carole did not need the full internal accounts. She needed only enough to make the pattern undeniable. In early September, she requested a private afternoon at Anmer Hall. The invitation was framed as ordinary family time. William and Catherine cleared their schedules. No equerries, no private secretaries, just the three of them in the sitting room that looked out over the Norfolk fields, a pot of tea growing cold on the table, and the thin folder Carole placed between them without ceremony. She did not raise her voice. She did not catalog grievances or demand emotional recognition. She opened the folder, turned it so both could see the first page, and said in the calm register of someone who has already decided the outcome, "If you continue to allow this, you are teaching Charlotte that the blood she shares with her mother and with her grandmother matters less than the preferences of people who were never meant to stand in that line." She waited while they read. She answered the few factual questions with economy. When William began to speak about timing and institutional sensitivity, she cut him off gently, but without apology. "The institution has already chosen its sensitivity," she said. "It chose it when it decided these appearances were acceptable. I am simply refusing to let my granddaughter learn that lesson." She left the folder. She left the house. She made no further call that week. What followed was not a scandal in the conventional sense. It was a correction executed with the same quiet precision that had built the original problem. Carole used a narrow set of relationships in serious journalism, people who covered the monarchy as an institution rather than as entertainment, to place a single, carefully limited story. The piece appeared in a newspaper that still valued understatement. It named no individuals. It made no direct accusation against the Queen. It simply noted that certain young people with close personal ties to the consort, who held no royal title and no official role, had been receiving regular placement at state level and major ceremonial events, with associated logistical support drawn in part from channels linked to public and semi-public funding. The tone was restrained. The implication was not. The story landed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, an emergency discussion had taken place among the senior private secretaries. By the following Monday, the informal allowances were under formal review. Within 10 days, the special engagement stopped. Invitations already issued were quietly withdrawn or reclassified, and a new internal guideline, drafted in deliberately dry language and approved directly by the Prince of Wales, was circulated across the relevant offices. Priority and positioning, Official wardrobe support and logistical resources at major royal and state events would henceforth be reserved for those in the direct line of succession and for working members of the royal family carrying out official duties. No press conference, no statement. Camilla was not publicly criticized. The granddaughters received no formal explanation beyond the ordinary shifting of diaries. Yet everyone inside the household understood exactly what had occurred. The Queen understood most clearly of all. For the first time since the coronation, a boundary she had tested and found flexible had been redrawn by someone who possessed neither title nor official power, and the redrawing had held. In the private rooms of the household, the reaction was colder and more personal than any public statement could have been. Camilla's displeasure was expressed in the controlled register she had perfected over decades, measured, precise, and unmistakably final in its own way. She spoke of overreach, of outsiders interfering in family matters, of the danger of allowing personal feeling to dictate institutional practice. Those who heard her registered both the anger and its limits. The guideline stood. William did not revisit the decision. Catherine offered no apology for her mother's intervention. The dossier remained locked away, known only to a handful of people. The deeper current running beneath the episode was never stated in any meeting, yet it did not need to be. Charlotte is Diana's granddaughter, in the only sense that still carries weight for a substantial part of the public and for those who loved the late princess most fiercely. Every time a non-royal child was elevated into spaces that had once been guarded for the bloodline, the elevation performed an unspoken comparison. Every casual cruelty directed at Charlotte carried the long shadow of older cruelties the institution preferred to treat as settled history. Carole Middleton, who had never met Diana, understood the symbolic stakes with a clarity that many inside the private offices found inconvenient. Her intervention was never only about protecting one child from unkind words. It was about refusing to let the institution continue a quiet process of substitution, replacing one lineage's claim on memory with another's claim on access and resources. In the weeks after the guideline took effect, the atmosphere inside the household shifted in small, measurable ways. Seating charts were reviewed with greater care. Wardrobe requests from outside the core working family were declined more frequently. Conversations that had previously drifted into half-tones about family inclusivity became shorter. Camilla continued to fulfill her public role with the same practiced composure, yet those who watched closely noticed that the easy confidence of the first post-coronation year had acquired a new edge. She had discovered a limit she could not charm or wait out. William said little publicly and almost nothing privately beyond what was required to implement the change. Those closest to him understood that the decision had cost him something. Confronting the soft power of the queen consort, even indirectly, was never going to be free of consequence. Yet he also understood that the alternative, allowing the pattern to continue until Charlotte absorbed the lesson Carole had named, was more expensive still. Catherine's response was quieter still. She claimed no credit. She discussed the matter with no one outside the immediate circle. She simply adjusted Charlotte's schedule and, on one ordinary evening at home, took the small brooch from its box and pinned it to her daughter's dress again, this time with no audience. Carole returned to Bucklebury and resumed the ordinary rhythms of her life. She made no further dossiers. She granted no interviews. When asked years later by people who had heard only fragments of the story, she offered the same mild deflection she had always used when the subject of the monarchy arose in mixed company. The only evidence that remained was the thin folder locked in a drawer and the photograph from the garden party that still sat in the private album at Anmer Hall. The palace has always been skilled at managing narratives after the fact. It is less skilled at preventing the quiet accumulation of patterns that eventually force a correction. In this case, the correction arrived without cameras, without raised voices, and without the kind of dramatic confrontation that feeds documentaries. It arrived in the form of a mother who refused to let her granddaughter be taught that blood and memory were negotiable, and in the form of an institution that discovered, somewhat to its own surprise, that it still possessed the capacity to redraw a line once the cost of leaving it blurred became clear. Charlotte continued to attend the events appropriate to her age and position. The non-royal granddaughters continued to live their lives, now without the additional scaffolding of royal logistics. Camilla continued to wear the jewels of her office and to perform the duties that came with them, and somewhere, in the long institutional memory of the household, a small precedent had been set, that favoritism extended far enough to touch the dignity of a child who carried Diana's lineage would no longer be treated as a private family matter. It would be treated as a matter of the institution's own coherence. That, more than any single newspaper story or internal memo, was the lasting effect. The palace did not lose control of a live broadcast or a carefully staged gala. It simply discovered that one of the people it had spent years regarding as peripheral had been keeping a more accurate ledger than anyone inside the private offices, and that when she finally opened it, the numbers were no longer deniable. In the months that followed, the adjustment settled into the background machinery of royal life. At the next Trooping the Color, the additional names were absent from the principal seating. At Ascot, the boxes returned to a more familiar configuration. At smaller family gatherings, the older girls still appeared when invited by their own parents, but the institutional support that had previously accompanied them had been removed. Staff who had once made quiet accommodations now cited the guideline with the neutral efficiency of people relieved to have a written rule to point to. The king, who preferred not to dwell on domestic friction, accepted the new arrangement as a matter already decided. Camilla, who understood power in all its graded forms, recognized that further resistance would only make the original pattern more visible and therefore more difficult to defend. There were private conversations. In rooms far from any microphone, the Queen Consort expressed her displeasure with controlled precision. She spoke of overreach, of outsiders interfering in family matters, of the danger of allowing personal feeling to shape institutional practice. Those who heard her registered the anger and also its limits. The guideline stood. William did not revisit the decision. Catherine did not apologize for her mother's intervention. The dossier remained locked away. What the episode revealed, more clearly than any public confrontation could have done, was the continuing force of Diana's legacy as a living constraint on the institution that had once sought to contain it. The late princess had been gone for nearly 3 decades, yet the protective instinct that gathered around her granddaughter operated with a clarity that older mechanisms of control could not easily override. Carole Middleton had never been part of Diana's circle. She had no personal memories of the princess to draw upon, yet she understood, with the practical intelligence of someone who had watched her own daughter navigate the same institution, that certain symbolic boundaries could not be allowed to erode without consequence. When those boundaries were tested in the person of Charlotte, the response that followed was not theatrical. It was administrative, documentary, and final. The children at the center of the story continued to grow. Charlotte acquired the additional composure that comes with age and with the knowledge, however incomplete, that the adults around her had chosen a quieter form of defense. The granddaughters of the Queen Consort learned, as children do, that certain doors which had previously opened with ease now required different keys. None of them was given a full account of why the change had occurred. They simply inhabited the new reality. Inside the private offices, the episode entered the category of matters that are remembered but rarely discussed. New members of staff were briefed on the guideline without being told its origin. Older members exchanged the occasional glance when seating charts were prepared and then returned to their work. The institution absorbed the correction the way it absorbs most corrections that arrive without spectacle, by incorporating the new rule into the background of practice, and by declining to examine too closely the circumstances that made the rule necessary. Yet the photograph remained. On certain evenings, when the house at Anmer Hall was quiet and the children were asleep, Catherine would open the album and look at the image of her daughter standing slightly apart on that summer lawn. She did not need to reconstruct the words that had been spoken. She remembered the stillness that had followed them, and she remembered the conversation that had taken place weeks later in the sitting room overlooking the fields. She understood that her mother had acted not only out of immediate protective anger, but out of a longer calculation about the kind of inheritance Charlotte would receive, not of jewels or titles, but of dignity, and of the knowledge that her lineage would not be treated as secondary. William, on the rarer occasions when he allowed himself to reflect on the sequence, recognized that the cost he had feared had been real but manageable. The relationship with the queen consort had acquired an additional layer of caution. Certain subjects became more carefully avoided, yet the alternative, an unchecked continuation of the previous pattern, would have extracted a different and more corrosive price over time. He had chosen the quieter confrontation, and the quieter confrontation had succeeded. Carole herself rarely revisited the matter even in private. She had done what she believed necessary. The ledger had been balanced. The boundary had been restored. In her view, that was sufficient. When grandchildren asked years afterward about the more opaque corners of family history, she answered with the same mild redirection she had always employed. Some stories, she understood, derive their force precisely from remaining only partially told. The palace continued its work of managing the public face of the monarchy. Camilla continued to perform her role with professional consistency. The king continued to prefer harmony where it could be achieved. And the quiet adjustment that had begun with a still child on a summer lawn and a thin folder on a Norfolk table remained in force. An invisible piece of institutional architecture that future private secretaries would inherit without necessarily knowing its full provenance. In the end, the story contains none of the elements that usually feed the most dramatic accounts of royal conflict. There was no intercepted telephone call from the sovereign, no smashed glass on a white tablecloth, no standing ovation that violated protocol, no live broadcast seized by an encrypted device. There was only the slower, colder operation of power being recalibrated by someone who understood that the most durable interventions are often those that leave the opposing party with nothing theatrical to condemn. Camilla retained her title, her schedule, and the public dignity of her office. What she lost was the comfortable assumption that the soft privileges she arranged for her own blood would remain permanently beneath the threshold of formal notice. Once that assumption was broken, it proved remarkably difficult to repair. The child who stood at the center of the episode continued her education in the peculiar combination of protection and exposure that defines every life in the direct line. She would never be given a complete narrative of the weeks that followed the garden party. She would know only, in the intuitive way children know such things, that certain faces appeared less frequently in certain settings, and that the adults responsible for her had, on at least one occasion, chosen defense over accommodation. Whether that knowledge will shape her understanding of the institution she is destined to inherit remains a question for a future that has not yet arrived. What can be stated with confidence is that the line drawn in that autumn remains, for the present, intact, and that the woman who insisted upon it required neither a royal title nor a public platform to make it hold. The institution will, as it always has, continue to absorb, reinterpret, and partially forget its own internal history. On one narrow but telling point, the question of who may stand closest to the children who carry the most contested modern legacy of the monarchy, the answer was delivered not by the formal apparatus of the palace, but by a woman from Bucklebury, who decided that the pattern had continued long enough. The silence that followed her intervention was not the silence of capitulation. It was the silence of a system compelled, without spectacle and without the possibility of easy reversal, to concede a boundary it could no longer pretend did not exist. That boundary now forms part of the quiet architecture within which the next generation will grow. Charlotte will attend the events that belong to her position. She will wear, when appropriate, the small pieces of jewelry that connect her to the women who preceded her. And the non-royal granddaughters of the queen consort will live their lives at a measured distance from the institutional center, not excluded from family affection, but no longer granted the logistical and ceremonial privileges that had briefly made them appear, to the observing eye, as something they were never formally intended to be. The distinction, once restored, has held. In an institution that often prefers ambiguity, the clarity itself constitutes a form of lasting change.